We have just seen that monopolistic markets generate very different allocations and less desirable allocations than competitive markets. A very basic question follows, which is, what are the characteristics of markets that make them have monopolistic competition or just one firm servicing the market, as opposed to markets that have many firms and perfect competition? What I'm going to do in this video is go through several of the main reasons that lead markets to have monopolistic competition. And the first one is the presence of economies of scale in production. Let me elaborate. Now, we know that competitive market forces, the same competition that we have seen before, with one twist in which there is entry and exit of firms, which is something more complicated and we have not studied, but it's quite intuitive, the results that I'm going to use. So with entry and exit of firms generates the following, which implies that the number of firms in the long run is approximately equal to the amount produced in equilibrium in the market in the long run, after there has been competition and firms have had a chance of enter and exit, divided by what we call Q mean ATC. Just to remind you, if you have a firm that has this shape of the average total cost function that we saw when there were economies of scale in production, this quantity at which the average total cost is minimized is the Q mean ATC. And that is a very special point because it's the point at which the cost of production is minimized, which of course has to be the case that production takes place at that level and at optimal allocation generated by a market. So what are we going to say? From this is going to tell us how competition is going to push the number of firms to look like in the long run. In particular, if you look at this ratio, if one firm can serve the entire market at its cheapest minimal average total cost, then there will tend to be monopoly. Otherwise, there will tend to be many firms. So let me do this with an example, with a graphical example, just to elaborate. So suppose you have a market that looks like this. Let's say the demand function looks like this. Okay? And I'm going to draw two situations. One in which, in the long run, there is perfect competition. So suppose that the average total cost curve of the firm looks like this. This is the average total cost curve that minimizes that. And this is, let's say, the Q mean ATC in this case, let's say it's 100. And we will have something else that we didn't study, but in this case, let's say that the equilibrium price we can derive will be in the long run, will be that. So let's say that we know that the quantity demanded in the long run will have been, let's say, 1,000. Then we know that in this case, the number of firms in the long run is equal to 10. Now suppose, in contrast, that we were in a situation in which the same market forces would have led us to a situation in which one single firm had an average total cost curve, let's say like this, okay, in which one single firm at its minimum will service all of the demand. Well, in this case, what we have had is that the price in the long run will have been this, the quantity in the long run will have been this, let's say 2,000, and the number of firms in the long run will have been 1. And by the way, this is also equal to the equilibrium in the long run. Now let me emphasize two things. First is, I'm putting the equilibrium prices here in the long run, and I haven't taught you how to derive them. You are not responsible for knowing this material. I'm just trying to pass you an intuition for how the economies of scale affect the number of firms, not teaching you how to solve long-run equilibria. We're not doing that in this course, so don't worry about those details. The second thing is that we are assuming in this explanation that the monopoly somehow is competitive. We are assuming what will be the price and the market forces in competition will lead to one firm. In this explanation, we have assumed that this firm will behave as a competitive firm. Of course, that will not be the case. As the number of firms goes down, when it becomes very small, they will behave as imperfect competitors. But the purpose of this diagram is not to show you what happens when there are very few firms. That's the purpose of all the material that we're developing in Unit 7 or 8, is just to show you that it's a counterfactual, to show you that market forces, even under perfect competition, as the technology changes and the average total cost function switches from this to something like that, will tend to kick firms out of the market and therefore lead us into the realm of imperfect competition and monopolist. Now, there are goods in which the benefit of consuming QI, of consuming Q, depends on what others consume. Let me call that on Q minus I, that is others' consumption. So in particular, not only depends, but it increases with Q minus I, okay? So in particular, there are goods, let's say like Facebook, software, and movies, things like HBO, in which the value of consumption for the individual depends or increases with how many others are consuming. Why? Because it makes usage easier, more pleasant, you can derive more value from it, etc. When that is the case, there will tend to be one monopolist, because one single firm will tend to dominate the market, because the intuition is there is a virtuous cycle for the firm. The more users it attracts, the more valuable it becomes from its customers, and that gives it a competitive advantage that allows it to attract more and more customers. So eventually you converge to monopolists in these cases. Now there are some industries in which production of the good that is sold requires the usage of a good, of an input of production that is very rare. And if that input of production is owned by a single firm, that gives a monopolist, the monopoly power over the market. So let me give you two examples of this. One is the Suez Canal. Now, the service that is being sold there, or the good, is transportation through the sea of bulky products. But it happens to be the case that to really make the transportation efficient, you have to pass through the Suez Canal that is owned by a particular set of countries there that have a lot of the ability to veto passage through that canal. And if that canal is owned especially by one company, they have monopoly power on that transportation market, at least for routes that have to pass through this part of the world. Another example is rare minerals. So it turns out that in the modern production, for example, of electronic equipment, some rare minerals need to be used that are found in a very, very small number of countries, and that the public companies of those countries are given monopoly rights over the extraction and export of those minerals. That one or two companies have almost monopoly power in that market. Another reason why monopolies arise is not due to any underlying economic characteristic of the market, like the ones that we have seen so far, but simply because the government assigns those monopoly rights to a particular firm by passing a law that says nobody can sell in this market. Now, there are two reasons why this government creation of monopoly rights are done. One is patronage, which is basically trying to give a transfer of cash to your political supporters or your family, and that is done by assigning monopoly rights, because as we have seen, monopoly rights can be very profitable. The second reason why these monopoly rights arise through the government is as an incentive for firms to engage in costly infrastructure expenses, in costly infrastructure investments, for example, roads. So suppose that you are a country that is really cash-strapped. You cannot really, your government finances are not in very good shape, and it's hard for you to go and borrow to build the roads that your country needs. One of the things that you could do is tell a company, come to my country, build these roads, and I will give you monopoly power, let's say, for 25 years. That could be profitable for both sides. For the government, because you will get the roads built, and then it will have them in perpetuity. For the company, because those monopoly rights for 25 years can be very lucrative. The final reason why monopolies are right have to do with patents and copyrights. So here is a story. In many markets, something called the innovator's dilemma arises. What is the innovator's dilemma? The innovator's dilemma is that in these markets, there is expensive, think of a large expense to design a good, but then the marginal cost of production is approximately zero. And not only that, the recipe is easy to copy. Okay? That means that you can have a firm invest billions of dollars producing a product, And then after it's on the market, any person can buy it and replicate the formula at basically very low marginal cost. Why is there an innovator's dilemma? Because the firm would like to produce the product. If it has high value for the consumers, it can make a profit. But the moment it produces without any extra protection, others will copy and they will not be able to recoup the investment. Okay? So this is examples of this are software, movies, medicine, medication. By the way, all of these goods that are heavily produced in the United States, and that's as a side note, since there are many international students, why the United States cares so much about this topic. Many of these goods have these production functions that looks like a semi-fixed cost plus mu of Q, okay, that we have been looking at. Now, what is the solution, the best solution that economists have come with to fix this problem are patents and copyrights. And basically what this says is that give monopoly power to the innovator for N years to recoup the large expense. Then he will be able to recoup the large expense, and the incentive to innovate will not disappear. Of course, there is a fundamental tension here, fundamental trade-off, which, by the way, is being debated in the United States very extensively right now in the right circles, legal and economic circles. And there is one between innovation and efficiency exposed. We know that if we grant monopoly power to the innovator, there's going to be a deadweight loss exposed because he's going to extract monopoly profits. That's a loss for society. On the other one, if the products are never produced, there is also a gain from granting that monopoly power, so the products are granted. And the question is, the fundamental question that a good patent system needs to design is, which are the properties of the goods and of the market that make this trade-off pointing to the direction of granting patent of copyrights, and if so, for so long, and of what characteristics, versus goods in which those patents and copyrights should not be granted. The reason this is a very hot debate in the United States lately is because we are in the middle of what are called patent wars. Companies are suing each other for what seem like really frivolous lawsuits that really don't seem to have anything to do with a true innovator's dilemma. I urge you, if you find this interesting, and I know there are many students involved in the computer industry, to take more advanced economic courses. This is a course all on its own and incredibly, incredibly important and interesting.